Okay, so tonight we're going to do our best to do a good overview of the first 11 chapters of Deuteronomy. And it's interesting, well, let's go on through a couple of these slides because this is tonight. You'll see that next week you'll have another, in this case, 15 chapters. And that will be about the law. And yes, it will go through the law. And there's some new additions, or at least some expansions on some of the things about the law. And then the last lesson will be chapters 28 to 34 of Deuteronomy. Okay, so we're kind of trying to divide the book into these three sections here. And so tonight we're going to look at the first 11, and I tried to just take a 30,000-foot level, two-word explanation of some of the things we're going to find, okay, in this book, okay. So we call him for his first address, but really, he talks throughout. He's got a final speech at the end. You won't get into Canaan until Joshua. Okay? So he's going to review where they've been. Why would he need to do that? There is a why. There is a why. Why? Why does he have to do that? Go back and review. Okay, all of those that were 20 years and older when they had gone in wandering are no longer alive. It's their children that are there. Okay, and so they've been wandering 40 years, and so depending on where you were born, you can do the math, right, of who was left out of the under 20-year-old group, and those that might have been born even during the traveling and wandering and that sort of thing. And so he's talking primarily to them, although there are some there. He implies that he asked to remember what happened, and so. Some of that could be passed on from their parents to them. There's at least 3, 4, 5 people that are alive that were there then, okay, all the way back to Egypt until today. Well, not quite, because Aaron's sons came along a little later, but they are there, okay. Then I say no one left, so that really should probably say everyone else is gone, right? So everyone else that was with them back in Egypt is no longer alive. And so they do a census to kind of determine who's left, if you will. He talks a little bit about where they are. He especially reinforces the idea of loving God, obeying God, two things that it appears that they have trouble maintaining. Right, sustaining. That's what happened in the first issue, right? And then thanking God for everything He's done, and then fearing God, having respect for Him. You might say giving Him the authority over their lives, which they also had difficulty doing. They just didn't want to let it go, give their life over, if you will, fully to God. Okay, let's talk about the first 3 chapters. I'm going to do my best. If you have the sheets, okay, I'm going to try to do my best, at least just to reference them some and stay within the pacing of what's in there. We won't be able to go to a whole bunch of details, go down some rabbit holes. Otherwise, we won't get through most of it. But does anyone know what Deuteronomy means? The name. All right, second law. Okay, so it's not really a new law, is it? It's a second repeat of the first law with a few additional explanations and additions to how it was said, okay? It still has the 10 commandments again, okay, that is stressed. And that is also kind of worded slightly different, but still saying the same thing. Okay, so Moses is basically retelling that the law, if you will, that we've read. And you'll find when you get into the middle section, almost word for word, not quite, of the actual law, from Numbers. It includes an extended view, if you will, of the Ten Commandments. Okay, and we'll find repeatedly an encouragement to keep the law, but we will find that God wonders in God's way. Okay, are they going to do it? He's seen what they said before. He saw how they lived before. Are they going to be able to change their ways? Okay. We find here in this first couple of chapters that God told, and think of, you're going to have to put, let's say, a pin in your memory of where this starts. This rolls back to when they were at Horeb, okay? And God was telling him then to leave Horeb. This is in his wording here, it's pre-spies, okay? Spies are coming, he'll talk about them, but this is actually after the spies went, but the story is pre-spy. Does that make sense? Did I confuse that enough? Okay. And so I think, let's see, I'm not sure if it says that in here, but it does say, I think the sheet said something about they were to leave Mount Sinai and to go to the land. We know what happens. So they do start. Now, I don't know how they calculated this, but when you have over 2 million people moving, basically they said that it's about 11, 12, maybe 2 weeks to go from the mountain to Kadesh Barnea, which is where they were headed to, right in that direction, okay? And that's where they're going to land for a little while, and they're going to send the spies off from there, right? He said something like, 11 to 14 days. And we know later it takes them 40 years, really, to make that trip because of what happened to them and for what they did. And then we find that some of the same things. Remember when back in Numbers 11:14 when Moses chose leaders? Okay. Well, in the first chapter he chose leaders again, right? So we have leaders being chosen. I think there's more here. Leave Horeb. Okay, leaders are appointed. So remember, he was having difficulty keeping up with everything, wasn't he? Well, they had 12 tribes. Each of them had people that would come to him. He was handling all the people's issues, all the judgment issues, etc. And so he instead asked God, can I do this? And God said, yes. Okay, and so he set up these 70. So he refers to that again in these first 20 verses, if you will, of the chapter. I think it picks up somewhere around verse 9. Now, so what comes next in the story? Since this is history, we already know, right? So what comes next? He sends the spies, and they refuse to go into the land, right? We see that in chapter 19 here of the first book here, first chapter, excuse me. And so I think that one of the things that Moses is doing as he's going through here is letting them see where they went wrong, if you know what I mean, right? And so I think that as long as he is able to emphasize where they went wrong, maybe they won't do it again. Okay? Maybe that won't happen again. All right. And then, but they did refuse, and we know that. And then what was the penalty, for that? We can see that in verses 34 to 46. So the penalty for their rebellion was, number one, what? Wandered for 40 years. Right? And where'd the 40 come from? 1 year for every week they were in the land. Right? Caleb will be the only one, Caleb and Joshua will be the only ones that will see the land. Moses and Aaron will not. Aaron will die here in Deuteronomy. And Moses will live through Deuteronomy and into a little part of Joshua, but neither one of them will be able to go into the land. Now, Moses gets to see the land, right, from a mountaintop. That's all he's going to be able to do. And then only the children, right, only the children of those that were over 20 years old at the time when they made the mistake of not following God's desires, and they had to wander now for 40 years. Okay. So I think a lot of these first parts we kind of know because we remember this account, right? The account is one that sticks in our mind, isn't it? So let's look at a couple of the other situations that come from these first three chapters. Who lives in Edom? Starts with an E. Edomites. So Mount Seir is given to who? Esau. Okay, Esau. And so when you look in the first part of chapter 2, there's several things that become kind of interesting, I think. This thing's not going to work out. I need Gutenberg's results here in front of me. Okay, when they are getting themselves through the land, they are not to do anything to Edom. You can see this in the first 8 verses, if you will, of the next chapter. As a matter of fact, it goes so far as to say what? Verse 6. You're going to buy your food. We'll buy your food. So that, we're not taking any food from you. We're going to buy water. Same thing they offer later, right, to Moab. And so they did not attack Esau's family. Okay. And God stays true to that in this case until later, right? Until the time comes that they have to be dealt with. But Esau, he had promised that land to Esau, and he told them to, basically leave them alone. He told him to leave someone else alone. Do you remember who that was? In the same area. Okay, I know we're going to be covering a lot of ground here, so I'll try not to leave it in your hands. But if you look down in verse 19, God tells them, when you approach the territory of the people of the Ammon, do not harass or contend with them. And what was the reason that he had said that? Who was living in that area? Sons from Lot, right? Sons from Lot. So some of the history is still, God made some promises during the original settling, if you will, of this area, and he's sticking with some, right? And so the last part of verse 19 says, I have given it to the sons of Lot for a possession. Okay, so they were to not to attack them, and later we'll see what attack means. Okay, when they do attack someone, and so God does not really place them all in the same exact category of those that He is going to tell them to attack. And how do you know who to attack? Well, God's going to go before them for the attack. Right, and so that's how they know who to attack. When you look in, you can go back to Genesis 19. You don't have to do this, but you can go back to Genesis 19 and verse 36, and that's where you find the daughters of Lot. Who they became pregnant by Lot, and who their sons and all were, and that's where you see God allowing them to be the father of the Ammonites. Okay? It says he's the father of the Ammonites even unto this day. Okay, wrong thing, sorry. Okay, and then beginning in the middle of the chapter, and we'll speed up here in a little while, but in the middle of that chapter, we find the Moabites, and they were to be also bypassed, or at least not attacked. But the interesting thing is, who lived in that area of Moab? Some that were related to those that frightened them, right? And where they did not go into the land. They didn't take the land because they said what was there? Giants, right? Giants. Well, and there were some in this area. They called them the Iman, lived there. There were a great many, and as tall as the Anakim. And like the Anakims, it says they are also counted as Raphim, but the Moabites call them Emim. Okay, so there were giants who lived in that area, and there were probably some descendants of them still there. But I thought that was interesting. It was a detail that I didn't remember until I started going back through some of this in detail. And then let's go a little bit further. Ammon, and that's down in verse, picking up right after that, verse 16. And verse 18 says, "Today you are to cross the border of Moab at Ar. And when you approach the territory of Ammon, do not harass them or contend with them, for I will not give you any of the land of the people of Ammon as a possession, because I have given it to you, the sons of Lot, for a possession." Okay, so we see Ammon as one of those who are not. Now, we finally get to an area where God says we're going to fight. Okay? And we see that, pick that up in verse 26. Now, at first they always tried, they send messengers, and they tried to do it peacefully. Let us pass through your land, let me pass. I will only go on the road, he says. I won't turn aside neither way. In other words, I won't eat out of your fields, and I won't attack your towns, etc. And but he did not want, the king of Shean did not want to do that, right? Or Sihon. And now this is the part that is one of the reasons they needed to be careful and make sure that whomever they were fighting, God wanted them to attack. And we'll learn more, it'll get more and more detail about this as time goes on. But if you look in verse 34 and 35, what do we find? We captured all his cities, that's this king of Sion, and devoted to destruction every city, men, women, and children. We left no survivors. Only the livestock we took as spoil for ourselves, with the plunder of the cities that we captured. So when God had them attacking someone, it was annihilation, wasn't it? I mean, that's the only word that I could think of. And, God had his design, God had his plan, and there were some who look at that and they say, why would God do that? And we won't be able to spend a lot of time on this, but simply put, physical life, it was physical life in the balance of spiritual life, was it not? That's where God placed his desires, his value. And so some had to physically lose their life so that Israel could save their eternal life, right? Their spiritual life. They do a kind of a rather sketchy job of that, don't they, later. But when they start off in battle, this is what they have to do. And this is what we'll find as we look at other battles. Okay? And then there's the next one, the one of the king, Og, right? Let me see here why this isn't working on here. Okay. The king of Bashan. Now, he's found in chapter 3, okay? And they defeat him. So let's quickly look at chapter 3. They turned, went up the way to Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us, he and all his people, to do the battle. Now, this is one of the things that God was having to work with the Israelites on, fear. They didn't seem to be able to accept God as their leader all the time. And so they were afraid sometimes to attack some of the people that they were going to have to. And they were on their way, let's put it, to becoming a mighty army, okay, that will be heard about in that entire Canaan land, okay, that all of them were going to be frightened of this army of Israel. But they hadn't achieved that yet. And so verse 2 tells them, do not fear him, for I have given him and all his people and his land into your hand. And so this is a big area. He took 60 cities. Okay? So they took 60 cities in this battle. And Og, thank you. So in the end, verse 11 says, for only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Okay, so you remember, what are they? Rephaim? Giants, right? These are giants. And he was the last one that was left. And this is kind of an interesting detail to have put in here about him. But his bed was 9 cubits long. So how long is that? 9 cubits. A cubit is what, around what, 15 inches or so, something like that. Okay, so it would be 9, so about somewhere around 150 inches. Okay, 7 feet, 7.5 feet, 8 feet, 96 inches, right? So, he was a tall guy, right? Big guy. And it's interesting that it says that 9 cubits was his length and 4 cubits wide, okay? And according to the common cubit, and so somewhere in here it says, and you can find his bed. You can locate his bed. But anyway, they go through and they take his land, take the king, and possess that area. Okay. And he gave, this is Moses, gave to the Reubenites and the Gadites the territory beginning in that area. And so we know that Reuben and Gad don't cross over, do they? They stay on the east side of the Jordan River and pick out some areas. So does half of Manasseh do the same thing, Manasseh. And so they are going to settle over there while still having to go over and fight with them. Okay. Let's look at this distribution of the land. Do you want to say?
Yeah, I was just going to comment. It's interesting in this text, it says in both cases they took the livestock of the land.
Mm-hmm.
And other places earlier, when they were in the wilderness, they didn't take the livestock. They were to kill all the everything.
And I think that, kind of hinting that God wanted total dependence on him, didn't he? And with what he was providing them as his nation at that time. But now everything in the land is theirs, right? Everything in the land is supposed to be Israel's. And, that's how God will act, from this point forward. There's some issues that will come later because God God determines that there are certain things that are his of the spoil, and you are not to take what was his of the spoil. And so that will eventually come out. So let's look at how the land was distributed. I don't know how well. All right, so this is a small version of it. I think I tried to get it bigger. So you can see on the right-hand side, you can't see all of it. You always here, you see Manasseh over here, but up above Manasseh is going to be, I think Gad's going to be in there. And then shows some of the northern split up. And if you look at, verse 14 of that, 13 to 14 of chapter 3, you see that where Moses starts to divide it up, going down to, I think, verse 17 of that chapter, showing how he's dividing it up. Okay, here's the other half, okay, of it. See Reuben below, Gad, and then the top is Manasseh. Okay? There's going to be some issues that come from this movement here. We've already said, what about the Edomites? Not yet. The Moabites? Not yet, right? And so those two areas remain, but the rest of it is going to be taken by Israel. And then we have the heartache, if you will, of what happens to Moses, right? And beginning in verse 23 of chapter 3, we see that Moses is forbidden to enter the land. And the way that's worded, later, Moses says, I'm not able to go into land because of you, the people. Of course, that's kind of how it turned out, isn't it? Because of their unwillingness to let God lead them, and he had to bring the water from the rock, but he did it in a way that cost him his entrance into Canaan. And but it says here in verse 25, Moses asks, can I please go over? But the Lord then gets angry, okay, in his response, and would not listen to him. And the Lord said to him, enough from you. And that's kind of, sometimes we say that, don't we? When somebody is saying, keeps on trying to egg you on, keeps on trying to offer reasons why, you should agree with what they're saying or doing or whatever. He says, do not speak to me of this matter again. So from that moment on, then Moses knows what's going to happen, doesn't he? There's no other avenue for him. And then God tells him in 28 to charge Joshua and encourage him and strengthen him. And we see the word courage and strengthen used in conjunction with Joshua quite a bit later on. Okay. So now we'll look at this group of chapters here from 4 to 11. And I think what I would say the focus, the biggest focus, is trying to get Israel to understand their responsibilities and not let happen that happened before, right? We know that originally God wanted to really, and I believe that we'll see that in one of these, the golden calf in chapter 9, where God wanted to wipe out Israel and start it all new, get a new nation begun from Moses. And but Moses was able to talk him out of doing that, at least offer him some things to think about. And God decided to relent on that and still work with Israel. But one of the first things that happens in chapter 4 is a reminder to not add, verse 2, to not add or take away anything from his instructions, right? And we see that same idea, right? Revelations 22:18 tells us, that anyone who adds to them, God will add to him the plagues. Okay, so adding and taking things away from God's word is going to end up, costing you. And that's what God's trying to get across to them in this case and in this chapter. And so when you think about it, what does adding mean? How do you add to the word? Pardon? Okay, something not authorized. A simple thing would be like what Kali had brought up. So they were told to leave the animals. They were told to take the animals. Okay, if they reverse that, then they would be adding to what God wanted them to do, right? And there's a lot of things that they do add. Okay, but that's an example of that. And taking something away, then I think one of the biggest issues is going to be what starts with an I. Idolatry, right? That's going to be the biggest issue for them. And so there's something where they've added to and taken away, right, from what God wants them to do in terms of worshiping him. And so don't add. I think that I'm using intersperse some slides from Matt, which I think are great, but I don't always know the voiceover as good. But they're not to add or to take away, okay? They are to do them instead, right? And what's the reason that they are to follow his commands? I mean, it's to save them, certainly. But so all of those around them, all the nations around them could see the result, the benefits of following after God's will. And it says in verse 6 that for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples. When they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. So having a law and following the law would go a long way to encouraging the nations around them to either join with them, to follow God, or at least not to oppress them and not to damage, if you will, them as a nation, not attack them. But then he gets even more detailed here in verse 16. And so from 15 really on, Moses is going to talk about idolatry, right? And so in verse 15, he encourages them to watch yourselves very carefully. What do you think he meant by that? You got a lot of laws, a lot of detail. It takes focus, it takes care, doesn't it? And Moses wants them to follow the law properly. Because in verse 16, beware lest you act corruptly by making a carved image for yourselves in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, or the likeness of any animal, it says. Or the likeness of any winged bird, or the likeness of any creeping animal on the ground, or creeping thing on the ground, the likeness of any fish. I think that the way I think Moses, we would say it today, don't make it an image of anything, okay? Nothing. No likeness of earth or heaven should be made in worship, and especially attributing that worship to the one God, right? No likeness of any kind. Because, verse 32 talks about it being that the Lord alone is God. Trees, animals, bugs, etc. are not gods. And they are not God. And so he points out in from verses 32 on that they are that God is God alone, and that there's no other God except him as the God. Verse 39. Know therefore today, and lay it to your heart, that the Lord is God in heaven above and on the earth beneath. There is no other. So the requirement is fairly clear to them, isn't it, in this case? And then he says he will make them a unique nation, right? And in what way is that? In what way do they become, if you will, a unique nation? Think about just a couple of physical things. Smaller army taking over and defeating larger armies. Even prior to this, when they were kind of working it out, if you will, they took Og with 60 cities. Okay? I mean, count 60 cities in Florida. Okay? You know, count the area that would represent. They heard God speaking out of the fire, right? In verse 36. You heard his words out of the midst of a fire. Kind of unique, right? Kind of makes you a unique nation, I think. And so I do think that God wanted them to see that and wanted them to feel that, but he also wanted them to live that, and they didn't necessarily do that. So in chapter 5, we see the Ten Commandments kind of restated, also reinforced. There's a few, in a couple of areas, there's a few extra things that are added to kind of exemplify the wherefore and the why, okay, about some of it. And then I think the rest of this book is talking about God's love and really God's goodness to them. And so, and you see here in chapter 6, verse 4, an interesting thing. He says, "Hear, O Israel." Now, I looked this phrase up, and I think I found it in at least 4 or 5 other places. "Hear, O Israel," right? And even in, I think in the New Testament, we can find this verse, this phrase used, if you will. "Hear, O Israel." And I think that's really focused on in this next series. It says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." We use that a lot, don't we? And if you do all of those, you're all in, aren't you? There's not a whole lot left of you if you're willing to do that. But one of the main things involved in this is this idea of hearing. And when you think about it, what does hear mean? Auditory receipt? Not only, does it? It involves action, doesn't it? It involves compliance. It involves listening for what is telling you to do and trying to comply with it. And I think this is really at the heart of God's law, and it's so detailed. You got to hear it, but then you got to do something, right? Once you've done that. And so here requires a response in this case. Those two things together become obedience, doesn't it? So you hear something, you respond to it, then you are obeying it. These last 4, and I believe that these ideas are kind of brought out in the lesson sheet. If we don't get through all of it, it pretty much follows this idea as we go. So this is the idea of listening, okay? Then you have love. It says, hear Israel. Now you say, love your God, love the Lord, right? And so that requires some commitment, but it requires an emotional bond, doesn't it? A willingness to share yourself with God. And a decision to do that, right? It's not something that's always going to be automatic. It's something you hear, you listen, you do, you feel, and you make a decision, okay? And when that happens, you devote yourself to something. This sort of algorithm, this kind of statement is something that happens to us regardless of whether it's this verse or other situations in the world today, right? Because we are people, we are humans. Right? I kind of... So when we think about it, we saw that Moses tells them, Lord, there's one of them. You've got to love them, okay? You got to listen to them, okay? Same kind of idea that I think that we need to carry with us even to today, right? Let's just walk through some of the other things. So, chapter 7, okay? Chapter 7 says, don't intermarry, okay? It doesn't say, doesn't give you a way out, right? Don't marry, don't associate. It also says that don't be fearful of the people around you, right? Obey my commands. When it talks about not marrying, no association, when he talks about idols in chapter 7, he says, break them down, burn them up. And fire, we know, will totally consume it. So, and also to detest them, to hate them. And if you think just for a moment about what they do in their worship, you can understand how it is an abomination to God. I wish we'd got to 9, but the golden calf, they had corrupted themselves with an idol, made a metal image. God wanted to destroy him. That's 9, verse 14. Moses saves them, right, by convincing God not to do that. And that's where we will pull up. I'm sure that Matt will do a little review next week. Be ready for that.